Get started.
Well, welcome. We're so thrilled to have you at the Napa Valley Wine Academy. We're thrilled to have Coombsville AVA and fantastic winemakers that will present the wines and the terroir of Coombsville. But before we start, we would like Jean to introduce Coombsville. Jean is president of the Coombsville AVA.
Thank you. I'm president of the Coombsville Vintners and Growers Association, and really I'm a glorified stagehand. My job is to shine the spotlight on the stars. And we have the stars tonight, and I'm not going to steal their thunder, so take it away, Amanda.
Thank you. To be clear, I am not the star of the show tonight. These three on my left are the stars. Thank you so much for the introduction, Jim. My name is Amanda McCrossin. I am thrilled to be here talking about Coombsville tonight because, frankly, I feel like this is a place that doesn't always get the love that it rightly deserves. So we're here to rectify that tonight, and I appreciate you all being here to assist. So with that in mind, a little bit about me before I introduce these guys. I have my background as a sommelier at a restaurant called Press, where I used to work and ran the wine program there for a few years. I am now a full-time content creator in this brave new world that we're all living online. And so I make wine-focused content and get to talk about wine for a living. But these guys actually make it. So that's who we're here to see today. To my left, we have Jen Williams. Introduce yourself.
I am Jennifer Williams, and I'm a winemaker here in the Valley, and I work with a couple different brands. Tonight I'm here with Arrow and Branch, and we work with a couple of vineyards in Coombsville, and one of them is our estate vineyard with some Cabernet Franc on it, which we'll be pouring tonight. Super excited about the wines of Coombsville.
Me too. On her left, we have Nicole Marchese.
Hi, I'm Nicole. I am the winemaker for Farniente Winery, which is located in Oakville, but many of our Chardonnay vineyards are in Coombsville, and so I'm really excited to be presenting some Chardonnay from Coombsville. I've been with Farniente for 19 years, so I've had a long time to be in these vineyards and really excited to share them with you.
We're excited to drink white wine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And to her left, Andy Erickson.
Yes, Andy Erickson. We have a small winery in Coombsville called Favia that I work with my wife, Annie Favia. And we've also been making wines in Oakville and Coombsville. We made our first Coombsville wine back in 1999 before it was Coombsville. So we're pretty familiar with the area, and we bought our first property out there back in 2007. So just a great area. It used to be a secret little pocket of the valley, but the secret's out. So we're excited to share it. So thanks for coming.
Yeah, we're excited to share the secret. I think just to start, show of hands, before signing up for the seminar, who had heard of Coombsville? Well, that's a really good start. A few of you hadn't, though, which is fun to see some interest on that side. So we'll start with a little brief history of Coombsville and how we arrived at this place, because it's a relatively new AVA in Napa Valley. It was established in 2011. It was the 16th AVA that was established. But before that, it got its start in 1846 with a guy named Nathan Coombs. I'm sure you can all put together how that came together. He bought a parcel of land and founded the city of Napa. In the late 1880s, it was then settled by several immigrants, one of which was an Italian immigrant named Antonio Carbone, which I think, Andy, you have a little tie-in to, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is?
That is, you want me to tie in now?
Why not?
Well, the way I understand the story is that Antonio, his first big parcel of land that he bought became the city of Napa, and then he bought a lot of land east of the city, which people referred to as Coombsville. It was his ranch, but we even have newspaper clippings from the late 1800s that had like happenings in Coombsville, and they would interview farmers and stuff. It's a pretty cool story. But we've been out there for so long that you used to just describe to people, well, you go out Coombsville Road and out towards the mountains and we're out there. But now that it has a name, it seems like everyone wants to come and visit. But it's very small. It's only 1,800 acres planted, is that right?
1,800 planted.
Yeah, Antonio, and what's funny, what I was getting to is everyone thinks it's a brand new growing area, but people have been growing grapes out there for at least 150 years. And our property was owned by the Carboni family, so it was three brothers from Liguria that settled the area, and they had a fully functioning farm and vineyards, and we're just lucky to have it now. It's really, really beautiful.
So as was the case with the rest of Northern California and the rest of the country, I guess if anybody was growing grapes elsewhere, Prohibition hit and things kind of went haywire and a lot of vines were ripped out. Obviously, winemaking came to a halt. And it wasn't until the late 1960s that new vineyards were planted in Coombsville. A lot of people at the time thought it was better suited for Pinot Noir. If you guys have spent any time in Napa Valley, you know basically it goes south to north, coolest to warmest, and we're talking about one of the furthest south places you can get in Napa Valley, just to the east of the city of Napa. So a cooler spot, more suited for grapes, or so they thought, like Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. But as we're going to learn later, there's some other varietals that actually work quite well. In 1967, no surprise, the Haynes Vineyard Chardonnay was planted. We're actually going to be tasting that wine tonight, which is really exciting. Andrei Telechev, he was a famous name in Napa Valley. He really instigated that. And then in 1979, a guy named Frank Farella, another really famous name. When you hear about Coombsville, they'll talk about Frank Farella. He's a famous name here. He decided to plant Cabernet and Merlot. And again, we're still talking about this time when people really thought Pinot Noir and Chardonnay was the thing to plant in Coombsville. Everyone was sort of ignoring these Bordeaux varieties. Now, you may have heard Farella Vineyard has really kind of come to full fruition. There's a lot of great wines made from Farella Vineyard, and it's now under the stewardship of a winery called Realm Cellars, very famous for a few 100-point scores there. In 1986, I always love this story. At this point, they're starting to get a little bit of recognition. The Farella Vineyard's doing really well. There's some grapes kind of coming out of this area. And this guy named Jason Pallmeyer buys a vineyard called the Caldwell Vineyard. And Randy Dunn, anybody know Randy Dunn? Up on there, Howe Mountain, kind of doing his thing up there. He gets wind of this vineyard and really wants a piece of the action. So he actually buys some of the grapes from the Caldwell Vineyard. And in exchange, he has to make some of those first vintages of Pallmeyer, which all are exclusively from the Caldwell Vineyard in Coombsville. So if you ever have the chance to taste old Pallmeyer Cabernet Sauvignon from the late 80s, early 90s, that's where that's coming from, and interestingly made by Randy Dunn. So I always think that's a fun kind of tie-in because a lot of people forget that there was some pretty big names making these wines back in the day. Flash forward to 2011, and we'll kind of fill in the details for you guys. That is when the AVA is officially established, and we become the 16th AVA in Napa Valley. Now, in between there, and kind of the reason we're all here, a lot of winemakers knew that these grapes were kind of something special. As I alluded to earlier, this is a cooler region. Therefore, you're talking about higher acidity, lower bricks, potentially longer growing season, depending on the vintage. And so a lot of the winemakers, or at least we'll talk about this later, as I understand it, were sort of using that as their secret sauce, their sort of magic ingredient to help some of these bigger Napa Valley Cabernets that are coming from the warmer AVAs brighten up, offer a little freshness. And so a lot of these wines that we know today that are coming from specific AVAs or just Napa Valley appellated have quite a bit of Coombsville fruit in them, especially if you feel like they have a lot of acidity. So I will not continue with any more history because I think you all came to drink some wine. Yes, me too. I also came to drink some wine. But we are going to talk a little bit about the geography and the terroir of this very special place. Andy, and not to put you on the spot again as you're drinking water, I'll let you hydrate, sorry.
No, go ahead.
You kind of talked about it a little bit. Can you just kind of set the stage in terms of where this place is located relative to the rest of the valley, and just elaborate a little bit more on why you chose it as the home for Fabia?
Well, I don't know if you can see the map from where you are.
Some
there,
of you guys have maps here.
But there's a great Coombsville map here that the growers and vintners have put together, which really shows the topography. And they talk about that Coombsville is an old volcanic caldera, so basically like the mouth of an old volcano. So they surmise that the ash basically went straight up and then it settled down in the lava. So you find these little pumice stones all over Coombsville, which are these lightweight, sort of white volcanic rock. I mean, it really is like pumice almost. And you find those. There's also 3 main creeks that run through alluvial deposits. But I think for me, what I think of when I think of Coombsville is that white volcanic ash in the soil. And it really gives the wines a strong character. Like in Oakville, we have the red soils on the east side that produce a certain style of wine that's very dark and aromatic. I think in Coombsville, you have that proximity to the bay that gives you all that acidity and even better color, I'd say, because of the cooler temperatures. but the soil is also, it's well drained. So you're cooler, but unlike Carneros, which is mostly clay soils, we have this great well drained volcanic soil. And so the wines have the concentration that people love when they think of Napa Valley. But for me, the wines have a more sort of European profile in terms of the aromas and the amount of acidity, and I really love that. So I didn't even choose Coombsville. My wife, Annie, is a viticulturist, and she came home one day and said that she found our property. And we lived downtown Napa back then. This was almost 20 years ago, and I said, this is our property. What are you talking about? Anyway, we ended up buying a great little property in Coombsville, and that was our start, and now we are almost 2 decades in and have this great little winery.
So it chose you.
It chose, well, it was chosen for me. It's also a great place to live. I mean, great small parcels, family-owned farms, and close to the city,
Yeah.
the city of Napa,
It
and
is
the
kind
city
of
of San
wild driving
Francisco.
around there, right? Because it's not like the rest of the valley where you can kind of see a lot of the vineyards. When you drive into Coombsville, it's, you're kind of weaving around. There's little parcels, houses. It's
I think there might be
residential
fewer
and-
than a dozen wineries out there too,
Yeah.
and proper physical wineries. Yeah, it's mostly small vineyards, so it's an interesting place.
Well, we're happy you're there.
Me too.
And as you mentioned, this is a project with your wife, Annie. I didn't introduce her because she's not here, but it's not just you.
She's the grape growing side.
Exactly. The climate, I kind of overviewed a little cooler. You mentioned close to San Pablo Bay. Jen, compared to the rest of the valley, talk a little bit about the climate of Coombsville.
Sure. As is mentioned, we are in Coombsville. We are very close to the San Pablo Bay, so we have this morning fog that is so wonderful for grape growing. And then in the afternoon, we have the bay breezes that help us, moderate our hot temperatures. So compared to the rest of the valley, it is a broader part of the valley. So when you think about the northern part of the valley, St. Helena, Calistoga, it's much narrower. So the climate there is just, it can get hot and stay hot. And so, in Coombsville, we just have it's just more airflow, more movement of everything. And to me, it's very much, compared to working with other sites, it's kind of a breath of fresh air, right? Mm-hmm. Because everything's moving at a pace that's more manageable when it comes to ripening red grapes. And the advantage of all that nice, cool climate is aromatics. I think that the aromatics we get from Coombsville are really expressive. The flavor profile is broad, so your fruit profile comes across as both red all the way to some dark fruit notes, which is lovely. And Andy mentioned also we have some exceptional color coming from that too.
We love to taste them and we love to smell them.
Yeah.
They are very distinct, and we'll taste that and smell that later. In terms of the terroir, I know we talked about some of the soil Andy mentioned, but Nicole, aside from climate, in terms of like geology, distinguishing features, what makes Coombsville, sort of, in your opinion?
I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that it is a caldera, right? So as Andy mentioned, it's a collapsed volcano, basically. So about 8 million years ago, there was a volcanic eruption that then just caved in on itself. And that you can kind of see that it's, circular where it would have just caved in. And so a lot of the soil profile is called rhyolitic tuff. I am not the viticulturist, I'm a winemaker from it. I have worked with amazing viticulturists, and so they've taught me quite a bit about the soils out there. So they're really fluffy and volcanic, and they're lighter in color. And one of the things about that light colored soil is that you can get great light reflection on the grapes out there. And so you get really great light exposure early in the season in berry development, which means you can get earlier phenolic development compared to bricks, meaning you can have some earlier pick dates and have phenolic ripeness and still some lower bricks, lower sugars, so that you're retaining some freshness, but you're also getting really great concentration without over ripeness. So I think those volcanic soils are super, super important for what we do in Coombsville.
I think that is the key to the coolness.
Yeah.
That it is well drained.
Yeah.
And so if you had coolness and you didn't have those well drained soils, then you'd have a combination that maybe doesn't ripen really well every year, but because we have those well drained soils, we're able to get a really lovely maturity on our grapes.
Yeah, and we're going to talk a little bit about ageability of these wines as well, which I think sort of lends itself to the terroir and the climate that we just talked about. I know I keep teasing that we're going to taste wine. I swear we are going to taste wine. I think just two really cool things to point out that I think I'd be remiss to not mention is, number one, we're talking about an AVA within Napa Valley, which has multiple different microclimates, multiple different soil structures, and we're talking about a place that's not that big. So the fact that you can have this level of distinguishment between this place versus somewhere else is pretty impressive, I think, for this region. And the second thing I want to point out is how cool it is that we have all Coombsville appellated wines. When I worked at Press, I don't know that I could use both hands and reach the end finger to give you 10 separate Coombsville appellated wines on that list of 1,500 selections. So the fact that we're here tonight talking about all of these wines that will have multiple different personalities that all say Coombsville on the label is kind of something to be celebrated, and I think a really big win for Coombsville in general. So let's taste some wine. All right. We are going to start with just a little housekeeping. Obviously, these are numbered underneath of you, 1 through 4 on the bottom, 5 through 8 on the top. We're going to start with the Farniente Chardonnay 2021. And Nicole, given that this is your wine, let's kick it off with a little info. What do you got for us?
Okay, so this is a very special bottling for Farniente. We make a Napa Valley Chardonnay. That is what we are known for. Our heart and soul is based in these Coombsville vineyards. And starting in 2019, we started to do just very small bottlings that were Coombsville only. So really limited, DTC only. This isn't what you're going to see out and about, but just at the winery. So very excited to be included here because this is like a passion project for me. So our vineyards are, if you look on, I don't know what your maps are like, but there is 3rd Avenue, which is kind of right along the edge right here, right at the base of the Vaca Mountains. And so we own several Chardonnay vineyards just right along 3rd Avenue, sort of almost contiguous. Farella's right in the middle of us. They're great neighbors. And a little bit up on the hillside up here as well. So this is a blend of 3 of the vineyards from out there, our Johns Creek Vineyard, our Carpenter Vineyard, and the Elke Vineyard, who we purchased fruit from. And what I love about it is that there's really great minerality, there's texture to it. In thinking about phenolic ripeness, we usually always think about phenolic ripeness in red wines, but I think phenolic ripeness in white wines is really important as well. The way we make our Chardonnay is that we actually destem and break up the skins a little bit, and I think when you have really great ripe skins in Chardonnay, it can add texture and body and structure to it and ageability, and that's what we're really striving for in this wine. It's been barrel fermented. It's about 60, I can't remember if it's 60, around 60% new French oak. And we do a little bit of extended aging time on this wine compared to our Napa Valley Chardonnay. We do not go through malolactic fermentation on any of our Chardonnays. We're really trying to retain that beautiful freshness that we get from our Chardonnay in Coombsville, and we want to have something that's refreshing on the finish, ageable, and pairs really well with food as well. So excited to share.
Yeah, this is super special, right? We've talked about how Coombsville is cooler. It's giving you, more of this lift, more of this freshness, and I think you really smell that and you feel that without losing texture. And this is sort of, to me, one of the beauties of California Chardonnay, and specifically from a place like this, where you have like all of this great weight, this great mouthfeel, but it doesn't feel heavy, it doesn't feel cloying. And I think so many people think of Napa Valley Chardonnay as this big, heavy monster thing, and this is not, right? This is bright. We would never call this Burgundian, because who cares about Burgundy anyway? But I do think that this has the distinctiveness of a Napa Valley Chardonnay, and more specifically of a Coombsville Chardonnay. You work with multiple different vineyards and places within Napa Valley. How are you treating Coombsville fruit differently than something else, or are you able to kind of do the same thing and get interesting results?
We do treat things differently. I think I'll talk a little bit about the difference in the vineyards, because you did touch on that earlier, that there's actually microclimates within Coombsville. So our earliest ripening spots are in our Coombsville vineyards, starting with our Johns Creek Vineyard at the top of 3rd Avenue and a little bit on the hill here. But there could be several weeks difference between when we pick our Johns Creek vineyard and a vineyard called Barrel Lane down at the end of 3rd Avenue, just because of the temperature, because cold air sort of funnels through, and it's later in phenology than by several weeks than some of the other ones. So we're able to we definitely pick differently in all the vineyards, and like I said, on our processing with our Coombsville vineyards, because I think that those skins are so ripe and there's really good freshness in the wines, we used to even do skin contact when I first started at Farniente. We've kind of moved away from that, but we do try to get a little bit of good stuff by breaking up the skins. It seems like these wines can handle some bigger oak profiles because they've got that great acidity to them as well.
And then one last question, I think, because a lot of people associate Chardonnay in Napa Valley with Carneros. Compared to Carneros, how would you make that distinction between Carneros Chardonnay and Coombsville Chardonnay?
That's a really good question. And we actually just purchased a really big Carneros vineyard too, so I'm learning more about Carneros fruit. I find that the wines in Coombsville definitely have more minerality and lifted aromatics, and the wines I'm making from Carneros seem a little bit broader across the palate than the wines in Coombsville.
I think I'm speaking maybe just because I have this glass in front of me, but for me, Carneros, the wines, at least the way that they translate in glass, sometimes feel like they have more ripeness. I feel like they have like a sweeter fruit profile, which I think this one definitely has that California sun-kissed nature, but I get a little bit more of those really pretty savory, herbaceous undertones. And we talked about aromatics. I wonder how much of that is climate and terroir in this glass.
Definitely could be, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we've got 2 Chardonnays. Also, who loves this wine?
It's so delicious.
It's delicious. Yeah, we're here to drink delicious wine in addition to tasting. I mentioned earlier that the Haynes Vineyard has a great significance to this particular AVA. This was planted in 1967 by a guy named Andrei Telechev. This is the Haynes Vineyard Chardonnay, and this is actually now under the stewardship of the Lawrence Wine Estate family. So they famously bought Stony Hill and Heights, Burgess, and so they're sort of buying some of these classic properties and really bringing them back to life. Not that they needed a resurgence, but I think as we smell this wine, it's going to be really fun to smell these side by side. You really still kind of get a through line, even though these winemaking styles are quite different. This sees 22 months in large oak casks, so it's not being barrel fermented. It's not seeing as much time in smaller French oaks. So you're not quite getting some of those aromatics, but you do get a little of that savory herbaceousness that I was talking about before. There's a brightness, there's a minerality to this.
I get it on the finish where there's this, like it's nice and broad across the mid palate, and then it comes back with good focus and precision at the end and leaves the mouth sort of watering for another sip that I think is in both the wines.
Andy, I know you make a little Chardonnay. Do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with all the descriptors on the Coombsville fruit in general, and I get a nice salinity on the second one too. There's kind of this salty character that I love, and that might be because it's how close we are to the bay, but there is really this fresh character that runs through the wines. We did for a while make, in honor of the Carboni family that had our winery back in the 1800s, we have a label, and we did for a while make a Chardonnay from some old vines right next to the winery, and it's just beautiful. I mean, especially when you don't do the malolactic fermentation, it just gives that green apple character that I really like in Chardonnay.
Yeah, definitely lots of green apple. Anything else you want to add, Jen?
I just love the freshness in both of these wines. They're really expressive.
Yeah. Any other comments from the audience on these 2 Chardonnays or Coombsville Chardonnays in general? All right, let's keep her moving. This is our last chance before we move to Redland. We are going to Cabernet Franc land, and Jen, I know this is not your wine, but we have to start the conversation around Cabernet Franc. I've kind of like buried the lead a little bit here, but I think if people are talking about Coombsville and they're talking about some of the great wines that are being produced here, they're also talking about Cabernet Franc, and I know you recently got a 100-point score for Cabernet Franc. So somebody's doing something right.
Thank you.
Congratulations. Can you just talk a little bit about Cabernet Franc in Coombsville?
Sure. So, one of the things that is so special about Cabernet Franc that sets it apart from Cabernet Sauvignon is that aromatic profile. A lot of people talk about violets and lavender stems, and earlier I talked about the broad fruit characteristics that can be in there. So in Cabernet Franc, you can get some of those like red cherry notes, but you can also see some of the darker, denser flavors of fruit. And so because of the Coombsville being that cool influence and that sometimes long growing season, we end up being able to just accentuate all of those beautiful components that set Cabernet Franc apart from other Bordeaux varieties. So I think Coombsville has become uniquely perfect for Cabernet Franc for those reasons. And kind of going back to the soils and all these things being really well drained, or not all the soils, but so many of the soils being really well drained, that's helping us with nice ripe characteristics in these red wines as well. So I can't wait to taste this one.
Yeah, no, and hopefully you stuck your nose in the glass as soon as you took the spyglass off, because even if you didn't, it kind of like wafted up at you. I mean, you just hit so many of the descriptors of this wine without even smelling it. Violets, lavender, all of those great sort of purpley fruits in there. I mean, we think of Cabernet Franc, we think of Cabernet Franc from all over the world, right? Everywhere from Loire Valley, where you get a little bit more stemminess, to here in California, Bordeaux, obviously. And we've seen a huge resurgence or surgence of Cabernet Franc in Napa Valley in particular. And I think it's super interesting that it seems to have found a home in Coombsville of all places, which is super fun.
And Coombsville might be uniquely, might have that unique ability to do it in both styles, both that really ripe style and the more herbaceous style.
Yeah, and Andy, I know you're working with Cabernet Franc as well. Anything you want to add on that front?
Well, I think everywhere in Napa is perfect for Cabernet Franc because I just love Cabernet Franc, but it definitely lends itself to producing more of that herbaceous style, which I really like. I feel like a lot of California wines lack that sort of savory tone in the wine. And I actually moved ahead to the next wine too, which I maybe shouldn't have, but I just I think what ties these wines together is that freshness and that acid profile that just holds the wine together and helps the wine age, but also just gives it this brightness and freshness that I like. So it's not just the whites. I think the reds benefit from that too.
I do too. Cabernet Franc fans? Any lovers of the Franc? Up and coming lovers? Yeah, I mean, this is, again, like going back to what I had said before about Coombsville on the wine list, the Cabernet Franc section was like this big. And you never saw an expensive Cabernet Franc. It was often blended with something else. But I think, to your point, Dan, there is something really special about Cabernet Franc in this particular region. And you smell that. And you smell that with the herbaceousness that you mentioned, Andy. I think you smell it with some of those florals. But what I love about Cabernet Franc, and especially from a place like this, is that you're still getting really great structure in these wines. There's like a lightness to it. Like it's almost like it doesn't have quite the girth that a Cabernet Sauvignon has. And I love that about Cabernet Franc, and I love it from all different places. But for me, if I'm in a place where I don't want a huge, massive wine, but I still want all that great flavor,
Cabernet Franc.
Cabernet Franc is where I'm going. This is so beautiful. Anyone have any thoughts on this wine? I think to me, I can't stop smelling it, which is the problem. I feel like I haven't drunk a lot of it. Nicole, any thoughts?
I was going to say, the aromatics are really beautiful. There's a dried floral character, and I actually get it in both of these wines slightly differently. Like, there's like this just dried potpourri floral that's really beautiful. And I really like you're seeing like a lighter style, but there's still like significant structure and backbone to it, which is nice.
Yeah, you feel the tannins for sure. They're there, they're structured, they're intense, but there does seem to be this lift to this wine. And I certainly would not shy away from pairing it with a steak or something of substance that's got, big,
absolutely
beefy something. I do think it's fun to taste it next to our next wine, which is the 2019 Silverado Gio. This is not a Cabernet Franc. This is actually a Cabernet Sauvignon. It's 100% Cabernet Sauvignon coming from the Mount George vineyard. This is actually the first vinifera that was planted in the Coombsville AVA. Just a fun fact, Gio is Greek for earth, and it's also short for George. How fun is that? This sees a little bit of oak, 92% French, 6% Hungarian, and 2% American oak. And just a wildly different profile in the nose, right? You kind of eschew all of those herbaceous things, no more floral, just straight fruit, but there's something sort of dark and brooding on this profile. And there's that intensity, right? But freshness. We feel lift, we feel life, we feel like it's not weighing us down. 14.2% alcohol. I always am nervous about having the alcohol conversation, but I know it's probably going to come up at some point. Someone will ask, should we have a little talk about alcohol levels in Coombsville and whether that's a thing, or we should just not talk about it? And he's like,
what are we gonna
absolutely
say?
not.
I mean, it's wine. It has roughly 14% alcohol in it. So, it does, I mean, even when we're harvesting much later, because of the cool temperatures, we get lower potential alcohol. So I think there's something to that. I mean, I think in Napa, if you try to make a low alcohol wine just as like a statement,
Yeah,
you're missing out because the balance in the wine comes later.
right.
And if you're in a warmer climate, the balance comes when you have a little more alcohol. I think we're blessed in Coombsville that we can be harvesting, and last year was an example where we were harvesting in the end of October with low alcohols, and it was really nice. So, is that enough of an alcohol conversation?
Sure. Well, you know, I think if you're talking about a cooler climate, immediately people are going to say, oh, are they making lower alcohol wines? And I don't think the answer is yes. I don't think that alcohol really has a relevant place in this conversation. It really is about just striking that perfect balance, elongating that growing season, and keeping the freshness in an area that gets a lot of natural ripeness and sunshine. I mean, we're in California. We're tan. We're enjoying the sun. And not these months.
Oh my God.
Are we tan?
Not tan.
Are we tan?
Not now, but like eventually. Let's jump to wine number 5, the 2020 Paul Hobbs. This is another 100% Cabernet Sauvignon. And again, I think if you guys do these sort of next to each other, it's really fun. This was harvested September 24th to October 1st, so I think it's a good time to maybe just touch on some of your harvest dates. 2020 is, I guess, an interesting vintage to talk about that, but we don't have to use that as an example. Harvest dates in Coombsville as compared to maybe the rest of the valley. Anyone have any thoughts on that?
You know, I have to say that I am often surprised that some of the properties that I work with in Coombsville harvest at the same time as some of my St. Helena vineyards. Do you have that same experience?
Yeah, for Chardonnay, generally some of our Coombsville vineyards are some of the first stuff that comes in at the end of August, early September. But we worked with a little Coombsville fruit for our Napa Valley program this year, and I was kind of putting them at like, oh, well, they're going to be later, and then we went out, oh no, they're not going to be later. It's like, and there was amazing color this year in Coombsville Cabernet. It was really intense.
Yeah, and I think that, so I think there's a broad range of what can be harvested, or of harvest dates within Coombsville, because of, you know, some of these different, we talked about the different microclimates throughout this little AVA. And so some people are, you know, harvesting October, pushing November in late years, and some people are, you know, middle of September for Cabernet or Cabernet Franc.
This, yeah.
Is the harvest decision still generally based on bricks or other factors?
I think they're, you know, typically bricks, and then also flavor, you know, going out there. I'm sure, I mean, we all are in the vineyards all the time before a pick decision is made.
Yeah. I think, most of you are harvesting based on phenolic and how things are tasting.
Yeah, and I mean, you look at the acidity in the grapes. The bricks is an indicator. Also, the level of malic acid. You want the malic acid to be low. That's sort of one of the things that gets metabolized late in the season. Also looking at phenolic maturity, so seed ripeness, color in the skins, those kind of things. And one thing that's great about Coombsville is that, you know, all these reactions, like the producing of color and the ripening of the tannins, those are enzymatic reactions which happen in a certain temperature zone, and I think we're in that zone just for most of that later part of the season. It doesn't get too warm, and we're in a cooler environment, so we do have a lot of great color in the wines and great aromatics. It can be a bit of a nail biter. Like last year was a cool vintage, and a couple of our Coombsville vineyards, it was, if we had rain 2 weeks earlier than we did, it could have been
Disastrous.
It could have been a different situation, but we ended up making some really nice wines. But at the end of October, and we do have some earlier Coombsville vineyards, but Coombsville is always the last stuff that we're harvesting in my little realm. So it's exciting.
That's a good segue into, like, what are some of the challenges that you face in Coombsville that you maybe don't have in other EVAs?
Frost. It's very cold. We have, and we're, it's a bowl, so if you're in the lower part of that bowl, in the springtime, it can get very cold, and so frost is a problem. And then just the later harvest, but I mean, the world the way it is, that's not as much of a problem as it probably could have been 20 years ago.
Yeah. What about like disease pressure, mildew, anything like that?
I don't think it's more so than other areas. Do you guys think so? I don't think so.
I don't think so, but you have shard.
I think we always face some botrytis pressure, but I find that oftentimes that is clone dependent on Chardonnay.
Does everyone know what botrytis pressure is? Can you talk about that a little bit? So
botrytis is a mold that you get on the grapes when you. Oftentimes it's like when you have a tight cluster and it gets punctured, and then you can have mold grow. It's like if you leave your strawberries in the refrigerator for too long and they get nice and fuzzy. That's botrytis out there, and if you have too much botrytis coming in, it can lead to, you can have color issues in your white wines, definitely. Farniente also makes a late harvest wine called Dolce. I don't know if anybody has heard of Dolce before, and so that is actually in our that's grown in Coombsville. All of our Semillon is grown in Coombsville. So I think that fog that comes in is really important for that botrytis development. But that happens later. It's not the early botrytis. The early botrytis comes and goes, and then we get late season botrytis after a rain event, and that's a good thing for Dolce for a late harvest botrytis wine.
I didn't realize that all came from Coombsville.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's all the Semillon out there, and there's another winemaker for Dolce. His name is Greg Allen. He's been making it for 20 years. What's interesting about Semillon for making Dolce is that you have to get the grapes ripe first. You want them to have really good ripeness before they develop the botrytis, so you have those really great apricot flavors that come through. When he's had vintages where the Semillon was underripe and still gets botrytis, you still get the wines come across as like jalapeno and bell pepper. So I think Coombsville is well suited for that because he gets some good sunlight, good long hang time for ripening, and then those foggy mornings that really encourage the botrytis to happen late season is really important for that. Sidebar.
No, I love a botrytis sidebar. Who doesn't? Just like I love a glass of Sauternes at the end of the night. It's great. Kind of getting back to this wine we have here, 2020 Paul Hobbs Cabernet Sauvignon. Super fun to taste these side by side, these two different Cabernets, because you're getting, again, all of this intensity. You're getting all of this structure. The fruit profile is actually really similar here, very purpley, very deep, a little bit more violet. But you do have more intensity of the palate kind of sitting in the center there. Any other thoughts on this wine? I think this is really showcasing a riper style of Coombsville Cabernet, but still done in a really balanced, sort of harmonious way. And I think that, it speaks to the producer as well. If anyone's had Paul Hobbs wines, they always showcase great California ripeness while still being balanced. And I think, it's a great expression of like what Coombsville can do depending on who is making the wine. Thoughts? You like?
I love this wine, and we actually get some grapes from Paul from this vineyard, and it's an amazing vineyard. So this is in the very far south part of Coombsville, near Skyline Park, if you know where that is. If you're hikers, you should go to Skyline Park, but this is a lot of that red soil. So you're right at the edge of the bowl, tons of the red volcanic tufa that we've been talking about. And yeah, Paul's winemaking style is a rich, ripe style, but I think in Coombsville that means it means restraint. I think this wine is dark and rich, but it has restraint, it has acidity. I really like this wine a lot.
Me too. No, I think restraint is definitely the name of the game when you're talking about Coombsville. And going back to before we had a flight like this was, can anyone speak to when they were maybe adding in fruit from Coombsville and not making a single bottling from this and kind of what that did to the wine? Does anyone have thoughts on that?
Sorry, when it was blended with something else?
Like when you were blending it in and it wasn't a single AVA wine, what that did, what was the blending agent?
Well, you probably do that a lot, right?
This was my first year working with Coombsville Cabernet, so
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
We actually used to blend or we still do, the Cabernet Franc in with Merlot from from Atlas Peak, so high elevation, and then Cabernet Sauvignon from somewhere, northern part of the valley. And it would always, so the Cab Franc would be blended with these kind of a ripe bank styled blend. And it would always bring, I feel like we keep repeating ourselves, but it would always bring freshness and aromatics to that blend. And like a really nice structure. I really like how you've pinpointed that it's structure, but also a lightness on its feet, because it's different from what you might get on a mountaintop, where you'd have structure and also maybe like a
Chewing on tannin.
yeah, more weight to it. Yeah. So that's kind of what we see in our blends.
Do you find that they're higher in color than other areas?
Yeah. Especially for something like Cabernet Franc, I'm always stunned by the colors coming out of there, because Cabernet Franc can go either way.
So we used to blend our Coombsville wines with our Oakville wines up until 2013. So we made a Napa Valley Cabernet it was basically 50% each appellation. And it's interesting, Annie always talks about the difference in the wines being like Oakville tannins are like this, it like fills your whole mouth, and Coombsville tannins are like this long thing on the tip of your tongue. When you put it all together, it creates a really complete wine, and the Coombsville wine as a blender gives a real savory quality too. So the freshness, but also some of those more sort of pencil-led dried herb tones that I really like to find in wine, even if you have to blend it in. So
Kind of traditional Bordeaux characteristics,
Yeah.
like old school.
Does anyone have a sense as to when the shift happened from blending agent to single bottling, vineyard bottling? Did that happen at a point in your careers that you saw that shift being made? Or was it sort of just kind of like spontaneously erupted?
well, once it had an appellation name, then everyone wanted to know what it was
Yeah,
about, right?
that's
So
it. That's a good point.
before that, it really was the secret sauce,
Right.
and then people asked where the vineyard was, and you said, "Oh, it's just kind of out there somewhere."
That's a good point,
So-
yeah.
I mean, that's how it was.
Yeah. So 2011 is
Yeah.
when it happened. All right.
Very good point.
That answers that question. Let's jump into our final wine before these guys have their wines to present. This is the 2019 Maroon Special Reserve. Again, 100% Cabernet Sauvignon coming from a single vineyard, the Maroon Vineyard. This was founded by a guy named Paul Maroon, who passed away, and it's the winery is now owned by a collector who still loves the wines, which I think is very cool. So this is 2019. So before we were having a 2020, 2019. Can you guys talk a little bit about the 2019 vintage in Coombsville as compared to 2020?
I think I have a 2019 here. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, 2020 was a challenging year in a couple ways.
So many, all the ways, all the ways.
So what I recall from 2019 was kind of smaller crop and smaller berries. Am I on the right track?
Mm-hmm.
And the wines that I've worked with have a real intensity of character, so intensely flavored, a really decent amount of tannin and ageability, but at the same time, a nice fruity approachability too. There's really, I think 19 is a favorite vintage of mine that kind of delivers on all sorts of fronts. I wanted to ask, do we know where the Maroon Vineyard is? Do you know where that is?
It's right next to the Napa Valley Country Club. Like you go
Okay.
up the same driveway, and then it's
Oh, right.
right there.
Okay.
So kind of in the northern part of the Coombsville appellation, is that right?
It's is it where
Kind of in the middle.
Hagen Road turns into
Yeah.
Third Avenue?
Sure, yeah.
Right there.
So like,
So kind
Like
of
right
just
in
west
here.
of Palmaz.
there's the country club right there. Yeah.
It's a 17-acre vineyard, so it's
Yeah, cool.
it's fairly substantial. It's so funny, Andy. I think once you pointed out what Annie says about the tannins, kind of like pulling forward, it's all I can taste now. Does anyone else kind of get that? We're all sort of moving that way psychologically, but I definitely get that in this wine. And I think it's closer in style to the Paul Hobbs, right? We have that ripeness, we have that kind of juiciness, but again, structured tannins without the heaviness, which is super, super fascinating to see in wines like this. I'm really excited that we're seeing more Coombsville appellated wines, and especially from great winemakers like this. And speaking of which, I think we should continue to drink these, but Jen, Cabernet Franc 2019, Arrow and Branch, which I didn't realize is 100% Cabernet Franc planted.
Yeah.
How
yeah.
cool is that?
It's very cool.
Yeah.
So Steve and Sian Contursi, who are here in the audience tonight.
So don't say anything bad.
Let's keep it nice, everyone. Keep it nice. They purchased the property from Tony Soder several years ago, and that vineyard had been planted to clone. We think it's called clone 1 of Cabernet Franc, and by the time of this bottling, we're approaching 40 years. So it's on the older side for the Napa Valley, certainly. And then when they had an opportunity to buy a neighboring property, they purchased the neighboring property and planted some more Cabernet Franc. So doubled down on Cabernet Franc. And in doing that, we're able to bring in some new clonal material. So we now have this property that is 5 acres total planted. And we have 3 different clones in there, which is really lovely.
Was that a scary thing to do, to like double down on Cabernet Franc in Napa Valley? But you're just like, eh. It's worked out.
Steve
so
likes,
good job.
likes the risk. He likes the risk. So we've been talking about soils and whatnot, and this property has kind of a Coombs, like a gravelly loam, and so we see a lot of the gravel pieces throughout this property, throughout this vineyard. And one of the things that's really advantageous for that is the vines, because of the gravel, they have more access to a broader soil profile. So they can move, their roots can move farther because of all that gravel. There's space to move. And because of that, I think they're able to get old, and they're also able to weather whatever's thrown at them. So I always think that older vines tend to be wise. They've seen it before. They know what to do when weird climate comes their way. And likewise, when you have like a extensive root profile, you also can weather things like drought and heat. Some of these odd things that might come our way. So I see, because of those things, because of the age and also the broader root profile, a consistency from vintage to vintage. The vines produce a really consistent, great product, great wine, year to year, despite the vintage, but not despite the vintage in a way that doesn't have vintage characteristics to it, but it creates something that's consistent. So this wine was just 45% new oak, a small amount of new oak, and picked over the month of October, so 2 different picks.
Were you ever sort of tempted to blend in like a little Cabernet Sauvignon, or were you just always like, this is
we do have a blend that we include the Cabernet Franc in, that's Merlot and Cabernet Sauvignon, and then this is something that has been a pet project of everyone on the team, that is really just showcasing that estate property the best we can. So it's really, we never want to sully that up. We just want to have the purity of that property. Yes.
You should go back to that first Cabernet Franc that we had, which is I believe glass number 3, to kind of just show the difference between the two.
And I think we had one question over here.
Oh, yeah.
It's on that subject, so it's
Okay.
so substantially different. I mean, I know it's
Yeah.
a vintage. Is this more your winemaking style versus what we were tasting before, or is this the vineyard, or what is the talk about?
That was the Covert. It's made by Julianne Fayard.
I think it's just a different expression of Cabernet Franc, and I think there's enough variability within Coombsville that you can have that varied expression. Cabernet Franc, I think, is, it's prone to having that, what am I trying to say? Like, it can have different personalities. And so you see that naturally in Cabernet Franc, that wines might have different personalities. And then within Coombsville, we also have different personalities depending on the, parts of the AVA that it was grown. And then the winemaker, yeah, also. But I do think, I know Julian, and I think these are both be driven by, the soils and the vines primarily.
The tannins seem more prominent in this.
I agree with that, yeah, than with the Julians, yeah.
Or almost the same as the Cab Sauv.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that.
Why?
Well, it's kind of a brawny part of the appellation, I guess, you know? So I think it is just how it is delivered, how that vineyard delivers.
It's also two different vintages too.
And two,
Absolutely.
2 years can be
Yeah.
a big difference between
Yeah,
ends.
yeah.
And also the 40-year-old vines. I mean, that's not even fair to most other people in Coombsville. I mean, that's pretty cool. Old vines make great wine.
Yeah.
And I'm just reading too. I'm an outside observer, but it does say that the covert was aged in new French oak barrels, and I get that oak component coming through in the wine, which I actually like, but it's definitely part of the style of the wine. Where I think maybe the vineyard profile drives the wine of the Arrow and Branch a little bit more.
Yeah. Jen, did you have to play around a little bit with different types of barrels, and how did the Cabernet Franc handle them?
That's a good question. We do, you know, follow the wines throughout the aging, and so I do taste. We all taste regularly and kind of see what's tracking, what makes sense, what doesn't. We remove things that don't, and so it's always a trial and error. You know, making wine and just making sure that it's on the track that you want it to be.
Do you find that less is more or more is more?
I like less when it comes to Cabernet Franc, so we try to keep it on the lower side.
What does the more do?
Well, you know, one of the beautiful parts of Cabernet Franc is just the aromatic profile that we talk about, the floral notes, the herbaceous characteristics, and so I don't want those to be hidden by any toasty characters, if I can avoid it.
Yeah. No, it's a beautiful wine, but it is a wine that I think shows long potential. It's a wine that I think wants time
I
to
agree, yeah.
resolve itself a little bit and really highlight some of those aromatics that are in there. It's so, do you all feel how deep this wine is? Like it like sinks to your, like doesn't literally sink, but it like kind of sinks to your gut, right? Like
Yeah.
it's dark, it's brambly, it's in there, and it's like, it's
Yeah.
right there.
It'll be
It's
great
focused.
in a handful of years too.
Yeah.
And yet there's still such a great freshness.
Totally,
to it
yeah.
That is just wonderful.
We just really wanted you to leave this seminar saying the word fresh.
Yeah. How many times can we say fresh and vibrant?
Very subliminal. Someone will say Coombsville and you're like, fresh. Speaking of ageability.
I think we have one more.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go
I was
ahead.
gonna save this question to the end, but it might be timely now. I noticed 25% of our wines, they're mentioning they're using native yeasts. So perhaps more than 25, which I think might be an outlier. I wonder, is there something in Coombsville with the yeast was my question, but now specifically these two Cab Francs, the first one was mentioned native yeast, and then maybe perhaps the yeast is one of the differences.
Yeast conversation? Anybody want to do it?
It's a great question.
Yeah.
I don't have an answer for it.
We did a yeast study before I came on to Farniente where they worked with Davis and they tried to isolate some yeast strains that were in the wines, and they found that there was a strain that was in the Farniente Cab, Chardonnay, and Dolce. So I think yeast may be more related to winery where you make rather than the vineyards where it's coming on. Yeah.
Yeah, the yeast conversation is always a good one. In fact, if you want to hunt down Michael Solacci at Opus One, if you want to have a deep dive on the yeast. He's done a few studies as well, and they've isolated one from their vineyard. It's in Oakville, which we don't care about tonight, but it is a good question. I think one hard to sort of quantify in this particular discussion, but always good to ponder and great to point out.
Would you acknowledge 25% is an outlier? That's a large number of native yeast, right?
I think part of the conversation has to be, I think there's, yes, but the conversation around native yeast and what that means and whether or not it is in fact native is another conversation. Am I?
I think that's well said.
Yeah.
I think I would say that there's really wonderful wines made with native yeast and ones made with commercial yeast, and I'm not sure that we could parse that out necessarily. Personally, yeah, I think they're both advantageous.
And challenging to work with native yeast, right? As a winemaker, you subject yourself to not only Mother Nature's whims, but also the whims of what the yeast decide to do on that particular day.
Is there one that you prefer?
A yeast?
Yeah, I mean, would you, if you're going to make, as you're starting out, is there a certain point where you think native yeast or I'm going to add yeast to it?
I'm inclusive when it comes to yeast, so.
Good answer.
Nice sourdough starter.
Nice.
Equal opportunity.
Equal
yeast is
opportunity.
okay.
Agreed. There's so yeah. But if you have the opportunity to ask the question, what do I like? If you have you have a batch of juice and you could separate it out and say, I want to try native on this and I want to try inoculate on
But
this.
you really don't.
We have at Farniente we have that ability to do that because we make a lot of Chardonnay, and so we can do trials every year and ask question. Our new yeast comes out, we're like, let's just try this on a few lots and see what it does. There's always an opportunity to learn which yeast works best for different vineyards.
Right.
Yeah.
And I'll just add to the yeast conversation.
all
I
right,
mean,
yeah,
thankfully
go for
now
it.
you can genetically test the yeast to see if it is a native yeast or if it's something that's living in the winery that actually is a commercial yeast. Is that maybe that's a native yeast too because it's
Yeah.
living in your winery. So, but I've done a few. They're not even trials. It's like a program that we have worked on to try to identify our own native yeasts from certain vineyards. And the most important thing to do is to make sure you test the yeast that it's coming from the vineyard if you want to know. I mean, in the end, I feel like these big red wines, the character of the wine for me is coming from the fruit.
Right.
So you can get very subtle differences from the yeast strains, but I think after 2 years in the barrel and in the bottle, it's not like a Chardonnay where that can
Yeah,
add some
right.
real complexity
Yeah.
to the wine.
Yes, for Chardonnay, we use a wide range of different yeasts because they're adding something different, and it definitely has a bigger impact, I think, on aromatic profile than in a red wine.
All right. We have a change in our program for wine number 8, a fun change. It is not the Cerosur, which is from a different place in Napa Valley.
Well, it's just out of the appellation because of the elevation of the vineyard. So we changed it up to make it 100% Coombsville wine. So we have our 2014 Favia Coombsville Cabernet Sauvignon is wine number 8. So
You can ooh and ah at that. It's a 14. It's 10 years old.
So that's kind of fun that the wine is coming up on 10 years. And just to give a little bit of background on the wine, so it's mostly, I'd say 80% from a vineyard called Meteor Vineyard, which is a beautiful vineyard right on that 3rd Avenue corridor. And tons of those pumice stones, very well drained, volcanic soils. 100% Cabernet Sauvignon. It's 3 different clones. And I love the 14 vintage because it was, okay, I'm going to use the word fresh again.
It's so fresh.
It was a cool vintage. The wines when they were young were very high in acid. I would say quite tight. But as they've been in the bottle, they've really opened up. And I think this wine is really just coming around and kind of showing what it has. And I love wines with age on them. So this would have been aged for about 22 months in 50% new French oak and not filtered or fined. Some native yeast, not all of it. We're not religious
native.
about it, but if it happens on its own, that's great. And again, that's some of that savory herbal quality that I really like.
I think what's really interesting is that despite this being 10 years old, sometimes that stuff kind of falls off. 10 years old, it's still very much there. You're really smelling.
It's gorgeous.
The
It's like
AVA here.
it's a nice time to be drinking it, tasting it. It's gorgeous.
I always love Napa Cabs at that 10-year mark. I think it's it's such a sweet. I mean, it's a very broad blanket statement, but a 10-year-old Napa Cab is just, it's kind of perfect, right? Like it's still got all that fruit, all that herbaceousness is there, and then still really great intensity, freshness. The tannins feel a little bit more resolved in this. How do you treat this versus something that you would make from like Oakville? Is there different tannin management? Are there different?
I think honestly, that's the one thing that is different is managing the tannins because the profile of the tannins is different. Just the whole phenolic maturity of the grapes is different because Oakville ripens earlier typically, and so you might have a little more robust tannin to deal with in the winery, whereas with Coombsville, I feel like by the time the grapes are coming in, the seeds are a little browner, the tannins are a little more resolved, so we can just sort of let it ride. We normally would do 5-day cold soak, and then the fermentation takes a couple of weeks, and it's normally about 25 days total on the skins for both appellations. But at the end, that's when we're really sort of either you can play with the temperature, or you can play with the amount you work the wine. We try to let it be just kind of sit there at the end until we like the texture of the wine, and we press it.
This wine feels like it wants to blossom. I mean, this was opened not very long ago. It's been sitting under spyglass, and it really has not had air. And to me, this is a perfect example of a wine that when you give it air is going to just shoot up. I mean, you can already feel it as get air in this glass, not an aggressive amount, but some. You can kind of feel it starting to give you more of that herbaceousness. It's going to start to put on weight. It's going to start to put on body. I mean, this is a perfect example when people are like, do I decant this? How do I handle? This is a wine that I actually would decant. I would let it sit for about 20 minutes and just start to take a deep breath. I think it's in a perfect spot for that. Would you guys agree? I know the decanting conversation is always a challenging one, but are you a decanter guy? You like decanting?
I like to decant most wines, yeah, unless they're very old. But I think, giving this, I would say like an hour before you want to enjoy it, because it really starts to open up.
Jim, where are you on decanting?
I like decanting, and I do decant. I think that I have mixed feelings about decanting. I'll be honest. Some young Napa Valley wines, like some of the riper wines, I think might go too fast if they are decanted. Yes, that's kind of how I feel about it. And then, but I bet things like Coombsville with that cooler thing going on might be just fine. Yeah.
Yeah, agreed. I think wines that come across as a little bit tight or restrained when they're young definitely need decanting, but maybe more vintages that are a little bit more generous and upfront and forward when they're young, you could probably just be good with just in the glass.
What are your thoughts on decanting white wines, Chardonnay?
I say yes. I do. I like it. I like decanting, especially when they're young.
And how about temperature?
For white wine?
Yeah, serving at what temperature would you like your Chardonnay served at?
This was about right. What was it? Like 40 degrees Fahrenheit? I mean,
Probably a little higher.
I think these were pretty. This was pretty good because it wasn't too chilled. It wasn't sweating on the glass too much. I think sometimes we serve Chardonnay a little bit too cold.
How old would your Napa cab have to be before you didn't want it decanted?
if I didn't want it decanted?
Yeah, really old.
Well,
How
our
old are you talking about?
my wines. I mean, I've only been making wine for 25 years, so.
Any
I mean, I think once you get to the point where, I mean, Burgundy is an example where you have an older Burgundy, you don't want anything to disappear before you can enjoy it, right? So the Napa Cab, I'd say I don't know, I would still decant a wine even if it's 15 to 20 years old, and then after that I'd treat it a little more delicately.
Yeah.
So after 20 years, you wouldn't decant for California Cab?
I might, but then you're kind of decanting for a different reason, to not get the sediment, right? I mean, the younger wines I like to give a vigorous decanting, so.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's also like very wine dependent, right? Like I served 70s Diamond Creek that needed an hour in decanter, and even then it still wasn't quite ready. They were just so muscular. But then you take into account some wines from the 80s that really can't be with too much air for too long, or they fall apart. So it is case by case, but I'm with Andy. I think post 20 years, you're decanting for sediment, and you're decanting really only for that reason, and then you just watch it evolve in glass. Wines of that age, from any appellation, want to evolve in glass, I think, over a decanter.
Based on the growing characteristics, based on the climate and terroir of Coombsville, do you think the ready-to-drink age of the wines here are significantly different than the rest of the valley, and the aging potential? Do you find that much different, or very similar?
I think I would say that it varies, because so many of these, I think we see so much variation here on the table that I would say,
Hard to tell.
I think it would be hard to tell. But I guess, I think from a gut perspective, it's probably because we do have some of these savory notes, maybe you do get a little bit more time in bottle than other appellations.
And also, jury's still out, right? We only have a handful of examples of single appellation bottling.
Yeah,
So
like
maybe-
10, 12 years worth, right?
Right.
Or
I mean,
14
maybe
years worth?
maybe two. I mean, we've got a few from the 80s, but not that many. The old Perellas, for example, are really beautiful and singing, and as are the old Paul Myers from Caldwell. Did you have anything to add to that? No? I thought you
I think the wines are very ageable. To me, it's a style thing. Like the more modern style, if you will, like to me it will age, but it's more approachable when it's young. Some of the Coombsville wines that I make, I would want them to be in bottle a little longer, I think, because that's kind of the way we make the wine. But you can enjoy them. You might have to decant them for longer at the beginning.
If there's a question about decanting, go back and just start revisiting some of these wines, right? And then that will kind of inform where you're at.
Yeah, I have a comment on decanting. I have a little rule in my head. I never decant anything before I taste it.
Good rule.
Yeah,
And
that's
I
a good
think
rule.
That the decision on whether to decant an older wine or not is really based on the perceived fragility of the wine.
Totally.
If you're at a breaking point on that wine, a short time in the decanter can break it. If I do decant an older wine, which I prefer to leave it standing for a couple days rather than decant it, but if I do decant an older wine, I make sure that I serve it right away.
Yeah.
It's not that I decant it and let it sit on the sideboard. The decanting, like Andy says, there are two reasons. You either want to develop the wine with aeration, or you want to drag it off of its lees, off of its sediment. But fragility is the key.
Sure, and I think Robert Parker used to say there's no great wines, only great bottles, and I think that sort of lends itself to the conversation around every bottle is going to be different and how it's been aged, especially as we dip into older years, how it's been stored, what the cork situation is. So yeah, taste every bottle that you decant. Yes.
Yeah, I just have a question regarding Cabernet Franc. You talked about it's grown differently, different grapeful characteristics, but is there something that you do differently? You mentioned the barrels when it comes to fermentation management, the temperature, cap management, possible aeration or delastage. What's kind of your approach when it comes to Cabernet Franc? To all of you, of course.
For me, I'm always trying to make. So one of the other characteristics of Cabernet Franc, I think, is that there can be a pronounced like edginess to it, if you're not too careful. So that's something that I'm always looking at when it comes to, how much we're pumping it over, or, anything that we're doing in the fermentation.
Edginess in terms of structure, or like some of the pyrazine?
I mean the structure. Yeah. So, very ripe Cabernet Franc is going to act just like a Cabernet Sauvignon typically, and but I do think there's some variability there. So that's the one thing that I am more conscious of when I'm working with Cabernet Franc.
Andy, you work with it. Anything to add on that?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Jen just said. I also think Cabernet Franc requires a lot more work in the vineyard during the season to limit the number of clusters, the size of the clusters, so that the fruit ripens in a certain way. If you have too much fruit on the vine, or if it doesn't get enough sun, you can have those it's more of a Loire Valley style Cab Franc, which I enjoy, but in Napa Valley we can do something different by working in the vineyard a little harder. But I like the edginess comment. Yeah, it can be quite aggressive on the tannins, depending on the year and when it's harvested. But in the end, we're trying to make a wine that has a different aroma profile with a similar structure to a Cabernet Sauvignon. So you're just trying to get there, but it's almost like a whole season's worth of work to get there. It's not just when you pick the grapes.
Has anyone seen any Merlot? And I mean, I know Farella Vineyard had Merlot in it, but are you seeing it? Is it something that you think could have a potential
In Coombsville?
Blue Oak.
What's that?
Blue Oak.
Blue Oak.
Is wonderful.
I think it's a great place for it. Yeah, I mean the Farella Merlot is delicious, and it's cooler, so it seems like it'd be a great place for it. Yeah.
We just need people to buy it, I think. Is
Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
That's the unspoken
That's
truth,
your
is you have to
job.
sell the wine.
They'll make it if you buy it. Yeah, it is. I mean, it's interesting, right? Like, would you be, if people bought it, would you be open to making Merlot in Coombsville?
Merlot's fun to make.
Sure.
Steve's
I
on
would-
here. Don't worry about it. Would
Yeah,
you want to
yeah.
make it?
Merlot's fun to make.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would do that.
I would support it.
Uh-huh.
There you go. I look forward to it. Exactly. Exactly. Other questions? Yeah.
About the history, considering the judgment in the late 70s, what was the impetus in 2011? Like, between those times, considering the popularity of Napa that boomed so quickly, what let it sit dormant, not as an AVA for so long until 2011 specifically? Who was like the champion, or like somebody that decided to represent Coombsville and bring everyone together to not just grow grapes, but have a name for themselves?
I think
It
they had
was-
tried once before, right? With
It was a long process, but I know that Aaron Pott had a lot to do with it. He was working with the Huneeus family at the time, and they have that Faust vineyard there, which started as a project with Quintessa, but then has its own character, and he got some of the other growers involved that, that you just have to prove that it has its own character, and it clearly does. So it just was a little movement that started, but I think Aaron was the one that kind of drove it at the time.
It's hard to get an AVA approved in Napa Valley.
Yeah.
I mean, politics aside, there's a lot that has to be done, and somebody has to take, and it's already a lot of work to make wine here. So I assume, yeah, Steve knows. But it's a good question. What did take so long? Jim, do you have anything to add to that?
I think one of the drivers was Tom Farella.
Huh?
Tom Farella and John Caldwell specifically really saw it, and really there was no opposition. What could you say? It's a Caldera. It's like the perfect AVA. When they put it out to the public, they had no challenges. It went right through. So it's a situation where the time was, right for that.
Well, we're excited for it. Thanks for the question. I think I saw one other hand. Questions? Anyone out there? Okay. We're watching you. I know you're watching us. I think we should just kind of go through these wines just once more if you haven't revisited them. I know some of you are out, which is a good sign. But these Chardonnays, Nicole, going back to these Chardonnays and kind of what they did on the nose, they're really, showing their ripeness a little bit more.
Mm-hmm. I think some of the floral notes are coming out a little bit more on the nose.
and with that kind of warmth, huh?
Mm-hmm.
But still, even at this temperature, still showing so lifted and bright. I mean, sometimes when these wines warm, they kind of get soupy if they're not, if they don't have the right. But structurally, they're still in really, really good shape. And I think speaks to the temperature question earlier, right? We are serving our whites too warm. I think it really shows a different character when you serve whites at a higher temperature and not at, straight out of the fridge. The rule for me is it's 20-20, right? 20 minutes into the fridge if it's a red wine, and then you drink it 20 minutes out before if it's a white wine.
It's a good one.
I've never heard that.
No?
It's a good one. 2020, I like it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And we, I know we talked about ageability of red Coombsville wines, but we definitely make Chardonnay that's meant to age. And I typically like our Chardonnay in like that 3 to 5 year range. We're really trying to make wines with structure. And I think structure is really important for ageability on these.
I've had your wines back to the 90s.
They're still great.
And they're great.
Yeah, I think it was something that Gil Nickel was really passionate about making wines that were ageable and that could be enjoyed for a long time.
Two very distinct Chardonnays, as we said before, with sort of a through line here, but so fun to see what winemaking can do in these places. As you go back to the Cabernet Franc, number 3, the Covert, still really aromatic, but has kind of, lifted a little bit. Does anyone still have wine, or is it just me? Okay. Number 4, we did the Silverado Geo Cabernet. Amazing how it's sort of intensified, right? The tannins almost feel a little grippier now. it feels like air kind of pushed it in a very different direction, which can sometimes happen with wines like this. Anyone else have thoughts on either of these two reds from the audience or from you guys? I think they're really fun. It's nice to see these with air, I think, again, lending itself to what it's going to do with time.
I know you.
No, go for it. You beat him.
I can't beat him.
You beat him. Yeah.
Fair.
Yeah.
Totally, you
Yeah.
can see, but I totally beat you.
You owe me $5.
You talking about Coombsville.
Uh-huh.
Campus, Coombsville, we source grapes all over the valley. So why, how do you compare Coombsville to every, sort of northern, AVA, Calistoga, and Rutherford, and Oakville? It's different, it's totally different. In my mind, I've always looked at Coombsville as totally more Bordeaux-like, but how do you see it?
How do I see it?
Yeah.
I mean, Coombsville, we're going to butcher this word, but it's fresh, right? Like, there is a liveliness to this wine, and I think when you think of AVAs like Calistoga, there is no shortage of ripeness up there. It's hot. You drive south to north, and there can be a 20 to 30 degree variance on some days, just, between the morning and then also just the general daytime. And I think it shows in the wine. There's an intensity to the Calistoga wines. There's a roundness and a softness, a plushiness to those wines. St. Helena always reminds me a little bit more of like a Margaux. Like, it's very floral. It's got the intensity and it's got the structure, but it's a little softer. And then Oakville has always been kind of like the Vegas showgirl for me. Like, it's just very flashy. It's everything. It's out there. It's very structured. Depending on which side of Oakville you're coming from, can give you a little bit more of that terracotta on the eastern side there versus the west side, which I think gives you more of that ripeness. And then as you move further south, that's when you start to, see lots of little pockets develop into different microclimates. And I think Coombsville is a perfect example of that, where you have lots of different pockets of Coombsville showing lots of different things, but mostly it's showing intensity of Oakville, aromatics of St. Helena, and the brightness that we want from somewhere like Carneros. So I guess what I'm saying is it's the best of all worlds. You set me up for that. Yeah. Is it your favorite AVA? Yeah.
So, and maybe this is a question to the AVA, the association themselves. I mean, would there be a quantification? I'm assuming that the diurnal variation is way less than any of the other AVAs, and probably even Carneros. But is that quantified? Is that a known factor for the?
So we haven't touched on that. It's a good question.
The AVA uniqueness.
The temperature shift is quite pronounced. But
Is it?
really what separates us, what made us a slam dunk for an AVA is in geography. It's basically the mouth of a volcano.
The soils.
Yeah, it's a caldera, and it's all volcanic. But I have a question for the entire audience, and that is like, what other sub-AVA do you know where you have world-class Burgundy and Bordeaux varietals? Think about that.
That's a good point.
That's a good point.
Yeah, you don't see, that's another huge distinction within Napa Valley. You're not going to see.
So we haven't actually talked about Syrah. I see it on the list here, but we haven't talked about Syrah.
There's some really good Syrah.
I was going to ask, but.
Another grape no one wants to buy.
I asked.
That's what we call the hand sell in the wine world.
Another variety that we all love to make and drink, and no one's interested.
Yeah, you make a beautiful Syrah.
We did.
Yeah, well, you did.
So, yeah, we did for many years, for 15 years.
No more.
But yeah, it's an interesting variety in that way. If you're not in the northern Rhone, I think you're not really selling a lot of wine.
Yeah, and I'm not sure the Rhone is really doing that great a job. Yes.
Yeah, so the winemakers earlier talked about how what guides them into deciding what to pick. With the rise of IoT devices, AI and ML, do you see those playing into making your wine decisions? Or how do you see AI, ML, and IoT, if you do, influence your winemaking?
I think, I don't even know what all those are. To be honest with you,
I heard AI.
so probably not a lot
What
for
is
me.
IoT?
Okay, Sorry, so.
Thankfully, I don't know what those things are either, except for AI. And I know there are the tools, but I'm a very analog guy. I love being out in the field and tasting the fruit. But there are some really interesting tools you can use to measure all sorts of things and make decisions that way. I just didn't work that way. But there are people that are good friends of mine that make wine that way, and the wines are fantastic. Yeah.
And to answer the question about IoT, it's Internet of Things, which is a device that's connected to the internet. I know there are a couple of vineyards in Napa that have partnered with Cisco, the networking company, to create devices that plug into the vineyard, so to speak, to allow them to monitor environmentals. So I'm just wondering if that's kind of the future of winemaking. Obviously, you can't remove the human component behind making wine. You don't want to remove the human component.
It's the future, and it will always be the future.
Yeah.
No, but there's, I don't know if, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I don't know if you guys are using this tool yet. We're going to start this year, but we've done a lot of work figuring out how to properly irrigate the vines. Like we would, in an ideal world, you would just dry farm the vineyard, but we don't live in an ideal world. So we want to give the vines the least amount of water necessary. And so we've done all this work with sap flow sensors and leaf pressure bombs and all these things. And now you can take a picture of a vine and it is 99% accurate to if you'd done those tests, which are very laborious. And it's all AI. And our vineyard manager and the guy selling it and all this stuff, they have no idea how it's actually working, but it works. And that's AI, and you just don't explain it, but you can walk up to a vine and take a picture and it'll tell you like, oh, it's 14.1 bars of pressure or whatever. Isn't that crazy?
That is
Amazing.
crazy.
Yeah.
So yes, it's out there.
It's out there, and I think we'll always be using that to some degree or playing with it, you know? But, I mean, winemaking has been a traditional practice forever. And I don't think all the technology in the world is ever going to take that away, you know? We're always going to utilize technology when we can, when it makes sense. But it'll still come down to tasting.
It's a brave new world. Yeah.
For the white varieties, I see Chardonnay. What other ones are popular? Like, is there a lot of Viognier or Chenin Blancs or things that are?
I don't think there's any.
There's awesome Sauvignon Blanc.
There's Sauvignon, yeah, that's true, yeah.
Do you make a dry Sauvignon Blanc for Farniente?
No, we don't.
Maybe you should.
Yeah.
I love Sauvignon Blanc.
Jen, do you have any other white varieties that you're seeing populate in Coombsville?
Well, if somebody has Sauvignon Blanc, they don't talk about it. It's much coveted. No, I can't think of any others.
Yeah. Interesting.
I have a question for Jim about the AVA as a whole. When you think about Napa and the population, the human population, and the vineyards and the space, where do you see Coombsville in like 50 years? Do you see encroachment from population growth? Or do you see vineyards?
I see Coombsville in the next 50 years just like it is now or just like it was 50 years ago because of the land reserve. And Coombsville's a great place to live. And if you look at this map here, this vineyard map, there's over 200 small vineyards there. And those are cherished vineyards, and people are taking care of them. We have vineyards, we have ranch land, we have orchards. It's very biodiverse. It's a great place to live, and I don't see it being encroached at all.
Well, it can't be now because of the ag preserve, right?
Yeah.
So.
What you see is what you get. That's it. Or you can buy something. There's a few things for sale. They're very expensive.
But interesting part of the history. So the reason that you have First Avenue, Second Avenue, Third Avenue, Fourth Avenue, the original plan was to have the city of Napa grow into that space. And that's why there's some smaller parcels. It was starting to be subdivided, and then with the ag preserve, that all got nixed. But it is, I'd say it's the appellation with the most people living out there, right? I mean, it's like in Rutherford, it's population 50 or something like that. In Coombsville, we got a couple thousand people living out there, right?
Further, it's the appellation has the most rock star winemakers living
That's right. I think what you are seeing and what we haven't talked about is a rise in price in terms of like grape tonnage, right? Are you seeing, I mean, I think most of you own your pieces there, but it's getting more expensive. I think what was once maybe a place that you could get more of a reasonably priced ton of grapes is not, you know, is more on par with the rest of the valley. Is that, would you agree with that?
I would agree with that.
Absolutely
Yeah.
true. Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure.
No longer a value because everybody has sort of woken up to what this place can do. It's pretty special.
At retail, in preparation for this class, I was trying to find some great examples of Coombsville stuff, and it's not exactly at a lot of retail shops a thing that they will feature too much. Do you have some suggestions where some good spots would be to purchase
Yeah, I
great
mean,
expressions of Coombsville AVA wine?
these
We
are all
have a-
small
we have a mailing
production
list.
wines.
Yeah.
You can buy them directly from them.
Yeah.
But
Understood. I'm
Yeah.
just saying, it was
But-
kind of a weird thing. I went to 3 or 4 shops and they're kind of like,
were they
a couple
bigger
of
shops or
things.
smaller?
Smaller, local in Napa.
Yeah, I mean, like I think it's not a huge place. What do we say? 1,400 acres planted total. So there's not a ton of wine to go around, which means, you know, some of your smaller places are going to get, you know, a case or two. So it's going to go fairly quickly. So, yeah, I don't know who's got it on the retail front, but you know, buying direct.
I
is
would bet
always-
I think buying- yeah.
Oakville Grocery has a pretty good
Yeah.
selection of all the different appellations.
Okay.
One of the
How'd that come
reasons is
to mind?
that a lot of them are smaller productions, they don't have national distribution. I think the best experience is to go out there and meet the people in the vineyard
Yeah.
and go out and taste and buy direct.
Acme
That's
Fine
what's gonna keep
Wines.
Coombsville going.
Have you tried Acme Fine Wines in St. Helena?
No.
Acme usually has some like great Napa Valley, very boutique producers, smaller allocations. K Laz as well often has things like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's just not a lot to go around. Yes, Steve.
You get a 2019 out of your pocket, actually.
The 2019 at Acme.
The one you just drank.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
Acme Fine Wines. Those girls are great. We love them. Good question. We love buy the wine. Support the vintners. This is all great news. Any other questions? We drank all the wine. We've used the word fresh.
Who was counting? Who was counting?
Times. I don't know. But I do think the moral of the story is that these wines really do have a life of their own. They are distinguishable. They have character. They have finesse. They have longevity. And they are something that's really special and remarkable and something to be celebrated. So I can't thank all of you enough for being here to do that with us tonight. Thank you to our panel.